the 28th of
February.
And you're in the office of Noel Robinson.
In the year of our Lord.
And we are about to
2013.
be interviewed. He is to be interviewed by myself, Robert Riddel, and Janina.
Hi team.
First question. What architecture qualifications did you gain and from which institutions?
Well, I went to QIT and I did the primary courses, of course, the diploma in architecture, which I did from, I think, 1964 to graduated in 1970. And then I had a break for a few years and I did the diploma in urban and regional planning at QUT. And I actually stretched that out for a number of years until they threatened if I didn't finish it on time I wouldn't get it. So I finished it on time. So I've got 2 degrees from, well they're not degrees, they're diplomas from the QIT. So.
Well, what do you remember about the people who taught you in those courses?
Well, they were quite informative, many of them. Cam Scott was really one that I really enjoyed from a design point of view, and I also worked with Ian Charlton, who was studied under Cam Scott, and I learned a lot from being in the office with Ian, of course, as well. And there was a number of tutors down there, and I mean, one from professional practice was, of course, Tom Cross, and Tom was actually, I enjoyed going through that part of the course as well, because unless you're sort of very carefully in sort of dealing with the legal issues, of course you get yourself into trouble, and so that was part of the whole process. There were a lot of students like you, of course, and Gil, who used to drive 356s and stuff like that always made some interest in that course. And during that period I was working with a number of architects as well. I started off with Powell, Dodson, Thorpe, and which I did first year there, and I was basically the print boy and used to run out and get the prints because they didn't have a print machine in those days. But I certainly learned, the basics there with Robin Dodds and also Stuart Thorpe. In fact, Stuart really gave me my first break into architecture. His daughter used to go to school at Wavell High, where I went to, and it was actually through, it wasn't his daughter, it was through Ansky, who was the principal, and his daughter was the school captain there, as I was a school captain. And so, anyway, Stuart gave me the first break as a student, and I sort of learned how to do banks and supermarkets, and they actually had a very good practice in those days. And I didn't sort of learn Robin Dodds's work ethic. He used to come in about 10 o'clock. And he had a great time, and I remember Stuart Thorpe driving this fantastic Studebaker, the big fins, So I thought architecture was great. So, and then I sort of was looking. I mean, I was always doing the odd little private job, because that's the way you sort of did things in those days. You needed to get some experience outside of work, and I started to do a few private jobs and competitions from fairly early days. And anyway, I went then to work with Danny Nutter and Ian Charlton. Was Curro, Nutter and Charlton, and Curro hardly ever came in the office. I got on very well with him because he was a musician, and so was I. So basically, John Curro would come in the office and say to me, "Noel, you're designing all these pitched roof buildings, you're not in the snow," sort of thing. Anyway, I did learn a lot there. Danny Nutter was a great technical guy, good specifications, really good, like practical things, you know. And he was also quite a good designer, but Ian Charlton was the sort of key designer in that firm. And I did Clive Foyster's house with Ian out at Yeronga on the river. It was a huge house, like, you know, as a student you're working on this massive sort of house with beautiful Scandinavian pictures and, you know, big rooms and billiard rooms and all sorts of stuff. And wine cellars, the first time I've ever seen such a house. And Clive was the sort of mining magnate. He had Consolidated Rutile, obviously sold all the mineral sands and things, but so he had a fair bit of money. And so a few of those things, it was a really nice time. I spent 4 years with Nutter and Charlton. And then in my final year, I moved over to Prangley and Crofts, where I actually had a pretty good run. I designed Eagle House just up the road, which was my first court type building. Big concrete fins, and it's still there today. It's number 82 Eagle Street. And I was given basically a free run on that, which was terrific. And I left that when it was coming out of the ground. I left it when it was about the first floor. And that was the first time that I had the power to be able to knock over a concrete wall, because it was all white off-form concrete, the building. And so setting the standard coming out of the ground was really important. And EA Watts were the building contractors. And first wall they just poured, it just buckled. So it was quite a pleasure to be able to say that's not the right outcome. Anyway, then I went off to London for a year and worked for James Cubitt Fellow Atkinson, and then I worked for the Greater London Council. In the Greater London Council I did a major project it's a housing project over in Heston, the old London airport, which is, I don't know, was major in terms of it's about 300 or 400 units, you know, the public housing. And went back a number of years later and saw the guys, and they said, oh, that didn't get built. And they said, after you left, Noel, they did all the tests on the ground, and it was full of cyanide and poisonous gases coming out of it, so they couldn't build on it. Anyway, so that was interesting. But going back to the course, I was playing music quite a lot during the course. So my regular day would start, I'd go to the office at about 9, you'd finish and you go straight down to QIT at 6, and then you'd finish there at about 9, then I'd go off and play music. I'd either go and play at J.C. Williamson's in the theatre, or I'd go and play at the Playboy Club. I used to play there 6 nights a week with Bernard King and Judy Kennelly, and then so that was sort of my life, was music. Or on the weekends you'd do pubs and clubs, and then I had a rock band called The Movement, which became second in the National Haley's Battle of the Sounds. And then I did quite a bit of different sorts of things. Well, I mean, I started music when I was 5, and I really finished at 25. When I was in 4th year, I sort of really stopped. I said, architecture's the way now, and music was behind me. But music actually helped, like, pay for the way through. I mean, in the days when I started at Powell, Dodds and Thorpe, I mean, I think I was getting about £4 or £6 a week. I mean, it was not a lot of money, you know. And so, but I was going non-stop, 24 hours. So sometimes, I mean, when I was playing at the Playboy Club, I'd get home at 2 o'clock in the morning. So, you know, I don't think Ian Charlton knew that. But yeah, like it was pretty full on. And I think music's got something to do with architecture anyway. And I think, you know, it's just it's a creative thing. And I'm not a classical musician. I'm a jazz musician. So, and I'm a jazz architect. I'm not a classical architect. Rob's a classical architect probably, but I'm a jazz architect. So, and you know, you might be different. You might think differently than that, but that's the way I sort of equate where I was heading. And so, for quite a time, I mean, and I mean, look, I played in the festival hall. We did various things, and one of the sort of notable shows was the Who, the Small Faces, and Paul Jones and Manfred Mann. Well, it's a backing group. I didn't back the Who, but I backed all the others. So I was up on the stage with the trumpet and with a whole group of people. So I used to belong to the Professional Musicians Union or Association, whatever it's called. My dad was a musician, so he was the one that put brass instrument in my hand. I played French horn, played for Dame Joan Sutherland in Deflator Mouse and things like that. So I've had quite a wide-ranging experience in music. So, but as I say, it sort of it didn't fully completely stop when I was 25, but it was about that time that, you know, like in fourth year, I got really serious about architecture. So you had to, something had to give, and obviously as well, like, because architects' pay wasn't very good. I mean, I had Robin, my wife, she used to work in the bank, so she really supported me. So she got sort of banker's salary, and anyway, it eventually changed. So in, as I say, I think we went overseas in '71 for a year. So that was our gap year, and worked over there. Then I came back, and essentially I started private practice straight away. I didn't go into anybody else's practice. I felt confident enough to go and have a go. And before we left, actually, we'd saved enough money to buy a house in Spring Hill. In fact, we bought 2 houses in Spring Hill, up in Sedgebrook Street. It was 26 and 22 Sedgebrook Street we ultimately bought. And then we leased those when we were away, so we were actually quite young property owners in those days. And I think that was, again, something that helped us establish, and you've got to have some, particularly the start of practice, you need to go to the bank manager and show him you've got some assets that you can borrow against, because I've found in most of my architectural life I have to borrow against projects. I haven't been lucky to have huge surpluses, and so I think that having assets to be able to work from has been a help from day one. Anyway, the main roads came along. They wanted to put a freeway right through our property. Actually, sorry, it was Brisbane City Council. And so we made 100%, or more than 100% profit. I think we paid about $6,000 or pounds, made pounds. We got 35,000 when we sold them. So we made quite a handsome profit, which then I was able to buy a property up in the other part of Spring Hill, which was 149 Fortescue Street. So that was an old public house, dated late 1800s, and I managed to get that property and fix it up. It wouldn't have been fixed up to Rob's tastes in terms, because I ended up by painting it bright yellow. And
I remember it.
And Robin and I started the Marimekko shop out of that property, and kept that business for many years. We ultimately sold that property and moved out to Clayfield and Ascot. So our business, the Marimekko shop, moved out to Clayfield, and we bought a house out at an Art Deco house out at Rupert Terrace, and ultimately did some work on that, and that was our family home out there for 25 years. But our younger 2 children were born in Spring Hill, and I think that the exercise in Spring Hill was a lot of fun, and I'm an advocate of living in the city, as you are, Rob. I think it saves a lot of time and effort and all sorts of things, and probably, you know, in terms of sustainability, it's obviously a very good thing. I currently live across the road from the office, and I walk 150 metres to work. It's too convenient, but there you go. And I suppose it depends how you value your time in terms of commuting and that sort of stuff. So, yeah.
Can I ask what made you decide to study architecture? Because you said you were into music heavily. So.
Yeah, good point. I actually was very good at technical drawing in high school, and I really enjoyed drawing, and I had a reasonable skill in that, and that's what really got me towards architecture. And I suppose that you just suddenly, gradually rather, just you approach each different bridge, and you go across it, and suddenly you're where you are. And I think that I didn't sort of consciously start high school thinking I was going to do architecture. It emerged.
I mean, that in those days, your primary school education included manual training. It did for me. So
Yeah.
you did carpentry, you
Exactly.
did sheet metal work, and
Exactly.
you did geometrical drawing.
Exactly.
And I think that was a great incentive to find out that you were good at those things. And
Well, you knew how to put things together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the other things that I did during my course actually, was actually to build a house. The Institute of Architects, we put on a display village, and Eddie Codd was there and some others. And we built a display village out at Middle Park, which was again a great experience because I think you've got to actually get in and build and develop a few things yourself. And the architects had to build their own house,
And
a
when did
display
that
house.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it must have been.
when you were a student or after?
Yeah, I think it was. Well, I think it was. Must have been. It was either late 60s or early 70s. I'd have to find out exactly, but no, it would have been early 70s. No, it was when I'd actually started practice. It was again. I did a lot of houses in the early days that were post and beam. I spent a lot of. We'll put it like this: I was influenced a lot by Scandinavia. When I went to the UK for my gap year, I had a Danish mate, an architect who I'd met at Prangley and Crofts, and so I'd spent some time over there in Denmark and Finland and Sweden. And there was one particular project which was called Moduli in Finland that I really sort of was incentivised by because it was just beautiful post and beam timber, and many of those early houses that I did when I came back were like that, either on a 3 metre grid or a 3.3 metre grid or a 3.6 metre grid, depends on the sort of scale of the house I was doing, and they were just simply post and beam with timber ceilings, and we started to do basically modular wall panels, which were fibre cement which had polystyrene inside them. We were actually making the panels and sticking them in. So one of the first houses we did was out at Chermside, which had these bright yellow panels, posting beams and inserts. So they were really easy to go together. And I still believe that sort of modular construction is obviously important. We're doing a number of modular projects right now that aren't really based on that, but they're based on different philosophy at the moment. But I think that the influence of Scandinavia in the early work that I did is very evident, the way that they go together. Because again, a lot of them were sitting on sloping sites, so you could actually just run the posts down and let the building float over the top. Then there were some buildings like the one that I did in Ballard Street that had a big space frame. That was Gabriel used to call them quadrupods, but we just did this big square and a pod and just anchored it back into the back of the rock. And Adrian Denuden was an engineer from McWilliams that I worked with in those early days, and we did a few of those type of buildings where we sort of cantilevered them out, put the buildings on top, and then strutted them back to the site. So obviously in the earlier days we're exploring structure and how that might work in the process of developing residential buildings. And it took 7 years when I started. I suppose I started around 72 in private practice. I actually started initially with Dan Callaghan for a year. Danny and I got on really well together during university, and we were always sparring off each other and sketching and drawing and doing our one-day design studies together. Because back in those days at QUT, you had to do a one-day design exam where you'd be set a project. And I remember the last project that we were set was a prison. So we ended up in one day you had to draw. You were given the brief in the morning. You had to sit down. You had to design it, draw it up, present it, hand it in at 5 o'clock, and that was your exam, your design exam. And like that really taught you to be pretty pragmatic about getting an outcome. So techniques of presentation are really important. And we used to have a toothbrush, get the ink and do this all over it. You probably remember this. And so you'd end up with this texture. You could actually do textures. You'd mask them all up, and so yeah, it was the way that you presented as well as obviously design a building within a day. So anyway, Danny and I started for a year, and at that stage the cultural centre competition was on, and we had a go at that, and we were really pissed off because we get anywhere on it when Robin Gibson got the job. Anyway, but those are the things you did when you're starting up.
So was that an open competition?
Yeah, I think it was, yeah. And like after that, it sort of like architecture's pretty hard to start your own office. It took me 7 years before I turned a profit.
And this is, you started in your home, as it was, in Fortescue Street?
No, actually started in Sedgebrook Street, 26 Sedgebrook Street. And I think Margaret Ollie used to do painting under the house and stuff, because we found a few of those paintings. I'm quite sure it was a studio before we actually bought it. I just can't remember who we bought it off. But we actually started in that property at 26 Sedgebrook Street. Had a beautiful courtyard onto Sedgebrook Street and did a little bit of work to it. So.
Well, in your student years, who were the architects you most admired?
Well, I think that the ones that really influenced me were obviously Le Corbusier, the Alvar Aalto was really big there. I suppose like they were the main two ones. I mean, local influences, there wasn't a lot locally. Some of the, I mean, Harry Seidler, I suppose, was an influence, a local influence. And, I mean, Glenn Murcutt really hadn't got going then, but certainly he was an influence as well, locally.
Although the course didn't teach anything about those people.
No, not really, no.
So how did you even know about them?
Well, good question. Well, I think that Corbusier and Alvar Aalto were sort of, I did know about. I'm not sure how I sort of studied them. I mean, you buy books and these sorts of things. I can't remember exactly when those things happened, you know. I mean, Mies was another one that I really liked in the early days because, you know, I ended up by doing a number of steel buildings that were influenced really by that direction. One being my parents' house, and when I came back. So I don't know. I just not exactly sure. Right? But they did influence me.
And did you, when you were in Europe, I mean, did you go and look out
Absolutely.
for core buildings?
Oh yeah, did the whole thing. Yeah. Absolutely.
Saw them all.
Just as many as I could see. Yeah, Robin was dragged around to every one of them. La Tourette and Marseille and all those, you know, they were all part of the pilgrimage.
I mean, is there one in particular that really you homed in on?
Not necessarily. I mean, La Tourette was really beautiful, you know, just sitting there and yeah, that was pretty special.
So you've already told us when you start practicing, and well, how many different offices have you had?
Well, after Spring Hill, I moved down to the old Shell House building in Ann Street. I think it was 301 Ann Street. It was it's an Art Deco building.
Next to the Masonic Temple.
Next to the Masonic Temple, and I think I stayed there 11 or 12 years. And I had a fabulous office. That was my best office ever. Had a whole floor in the building, and in a beautiful Art Deco building. You know, the old elevators that you close with the concertina metal doors, and it was a really beautiful building. And I lived in an Art Deco house at that stage, so I was living in my own era, if you know what I mean, sort of. And I just enjoyed the character of those buildings and having that as a studio space. And not only that, I probably had the best collection of Arctic furniture in Australia, because what happened was when we had Merry Mecco, the same Russell Whitechurch was the guy in Sydney who was actually the importer for all those things. So we had access to buy
You know about the fortune.
Yes, well, anyways.
There's a question here that says, what do you consider to be your most important work and why?
That's a good question. It's hard to say that there's one important work. Everything it's timely of what you do. I mean, at the time, you think that what you've done is important. And the way that I answer that is, I haven't built my most important work yet, right?
Okay.
But I think, well, there are a lot of buildings that shape you, and they depend on, obviously, what the project is, how challenging it is, and what you can achieve. And, there are a number of projects that I think have been important, like Mincom building was an important building. It was a difficult building because it went over 3 railway tunnels. It was a project that had to convince clients that they should be in the city rather than out in the suburbs, and it was the first large office plate in Brisbane, and so it was a massive footprint. It was about a 3,000 metre footprint, and it had 30 metre beams going across these 3 railway lines, and so you ended up with a building that's got it's got an underground swimming pool and gym that runs between the railway lines. Some of the stuff you can't see in it. And then it's got this massive scale because it basically goes over a full city block. So you've got to scale it horizontally, and then you've got to scale it vertically, and the top 2 floors you lighten it up so that it doesn't look so big. So, I mean, that building was quite challenging for engineering and architectural and urban design reasons. And then you go to a building like the Kingston Smith Memorial at the airport, which is a beautiful building. And like, it's the people who work with you. John Hawkins worked with me on that, and John and I were very close for many years and still are. And John worked with a number of buildings with me. He worked on KSM, and he worked on the Canlon Centre, which is a really interesting building that we did. It's got this layered facade along the front and a sort of exposed elevator within the sort of layered garden. So yeah, you work with people that get reasonably good outcomes. So, yeah.
And you've been in partnership with a few people.
Well, the process that I've been through is this. In 1988, we came together with, it was Blythe Jessup Bretnell then. We then turned that into Noel Robinson, and that went for 3 years, which was good 3 years. I don't have any really complaints about that process, and for me it worked very well, and we did a number of award-winning buildings together, the Golden Carts with the police headquarters, and Lake Crackenback, which was a Solomon Award building, and that resulted, in fact, at that time when I came together, I had an office in Sydney and an office in Canberra, and I've tended to do that over the years. I mean, I'd expanded into those offices, and I'd started this office in the Rocks, and I had Colin down there, and then an office in Canberra running together, which was out of Northbourne Avenue, out of the Sir Winston Churchill building, and I did a number of projects down there then for the NCDC. We did a number of housing projects for Greg Deese, who was running NCDC at that time. So basically what happened when I came together with Blythe Jessup Bretnell, our offices merged, and they gained a Sydney office and a Canberra office as part of that merger. Anyway, after 3 years, I felt that I'd still want to do my own thing. But what happened, my office structure, because I was the way that my office was always a shareholding office in that merger, and they did the same thing. And it was quite easy then to let the shareholding drift apart. It was quite easy to do that. And in those days, both Shane Thompson and James Gross, they were with me, and I think I went some way to training them a little bit. And I've also had Brian Donovan in the office up at Spring Hill when he was going through. So there are a number of good people that have been with me, and I've enjoyed working with. So, and I hope they think they've been able to get some decent training and mentoring out of me at the same time. So so that was that bit. And then not sure of the exact year, but a number of years later we did. I put together an alliance with Richard Denham out of Sydney, which we ultimately branded as Design Inc., which was a generic name. And that was really to get a national practice easily put together without having to deal with shareholding issues and all those sorts of things. So it started off as an alliance, and that went. I stayed in it for 10 years, but I started it with Richard Denham, which was SJPH out of Sydney. He was basically ex-Leighton's guy, their design head guru, and again we did quite a lot of work with that. We put together Melbourne, which was something McDonald, and then we put together Adelaide and Perth. So we had a national alliance. At the end of the day, it didn't work for me because we couldn't get it all together as a shareholder. So, I mean, as an exit strategy, as you know, Rob, you've got to look at it when you're in practice, where you're going to end up, potentially. And you either end up like a Harry Seidler or a Glenn Murgett, where you finish your practice and that's it, or you look together how you might deal with the business growth, and whether you're looking at leadership and ownership transition and all these sorts of things. And so, to me at that particular stage, which is probably now 15 years ago, was to look at a generic, put together a big practice, and that was an exit strategy where your name's not involved. Again, our business that we'd started 40 years ago was still the shareholder in that process. But I think the issue is, again, for me it didn't work because ultimately we just couldn't put the whole thing together. I couldn't put it together in the way that I would like to see it. That's all. So it was a difficult thing at the end to pull out, but pulled out about 5 years ago, and now heading into a new phase I'm not sure where I'm going yet.
Oh, well, it looks pretty convincing.
Well, it might work and it might not.
So, which buildings, now we're talking about the years for this study is 1945 to 1975.
Yep.
So think about those. Which buildings constructed in Queensland between those years do you consider significant, either personally or generally?
Good question. Well, I think you'd have to say that the art gallery was a significant building. I'm not sure which year that was built.
Must have been about 83 or 4.
So it's out of the 75 range.
But it was probably designed.
Well, the competition was sort of around when Danny and I sort of first started. So maybe it was around then. I mean, that is a significant building. 45 onwards, wow, that's a good question.
Well, I mean, the modern buildings in the city at that stage, you had the TNG building, you had the executive building, you had the SGIO, you had the MLC, you had the Hammerson.
Yeah.
I mean, Prangy and Cross were doing
That's
some pretty nice buildings.
Yeah.
Pearl.
And I think, well, that's correct. And that was one of the things that attracted me to that firm at that particular time, because they did have the majority of the major commercial work around town, and I wanted to certainly get experience in doing a major commercial building. And you're right, they'd started to do all of those things. Plus, who was the other firm doing all that? Peddlethorpe and Harvey were the other ones, and they were obviously doing the Gold Tower and the Blue Tower and all that sort of stuff. So these two commercial firms were sort of in competition to be the main commercial architects of the city. So I think that yes, I mean from the city point of view, those buildings were significant. Whether they were ultimately appropriate for a subtropical climate's another matter. But they were the sort of forerunners of what commercial buildings should be all about. And like designing a commercial building, I'm always very interested in. I mean, must have been 89, because I was a partner then at Noel Robinson. Suncorp commissioned me in the firm with myself to do this, to go around the world with them to pick an architect to do the project. They had a big site down at Coolangatta on the beach, and they had where the current BAC building is. So we went around and we actually selected Ricardo Leoretta to do the Surfers Paradise one, and I'm trying to think who we got now to do the one in Brisbane. But going around and seeing all those different firms was quite an exciting part of understanding what was going to happen in the city. And I think that that's getting off a bit of the track actually, talking about which are the most important ones. But I think that we didn't see anything like CP1 or CP2 till the mid to late 80s, and they were obviously very important international architects. So I was probably where I was sort of heading and drifting off towards is we still had local architects challenging and designing buildings that were like being developed in the United States of America and Europe that we really hadn't seen here before. So going and testing these things and seeing how you get the net to grosses working and all these sorts of things became quite interesting to me, and I think that that's something, as I say, why I ended up looking at that part at the end of my studies of getting into a firm that was doing that.
Well, there was Birrell as well. I mean,
of course, and mate, he was just sensational. Thanks for reminding me, Jim. He's not very well at the moment, but I mean, he was doing some sensational work. Not only at universities, in fact, in particular, his universities, things like the Astor Terrace car park and that sort of stuff. He was a real true artist. He was a great, and he still is a great raconteur. He thought wider than just the building, and did some beautiful work. His sculpture, the outcome of the buildings were just really great buildings.
I mean, how do you compare him to someone like Dalton, for instance, who was...
Well, I think Jim's really, again, I respect John Dalton's work immensely, and again influenced a number of things from his beautiful simple white buildings and pitched roofs and those sorts of things are quite memorable. But Jim, I think, was, you know, probably in my view one of the leaders in that era, because he could challenge and get buildings that had a larger scale and yet build them as pieces of sculpture as well. He was able to deal, like the Townsville Library and the way it sits in the big roofs and the overhangs and the curves. I mean, you know, he was sort of a bit of a Louis Kahn, but, you know, probably better. But,
and he had some good people with him.
Absolutely. And John Kershaw I worked with. John was there for ages. You know Jack.
Yeah.
And Jack ended up by doing work at Parliament House, and I spent a lot of time with Jack in Canberra and all sorts of stuff. And Jack's been a good mate of mine. Actually, Jack used to work with Curran and Charlton when I was there. So I became good friends with him, yes. But yeah, Birrell had some great people with him that he mentored through the process.
I mean, Curran and Charlton was a pretty outstanding practice at that time. Were they in Ivory Street when you worked there?
Yeah. I was down the bottom. We used to look right down the river. Sense little office.
Under the bridge?
Under the bridge was just great. And that office has been since demolished, of course, but it was a great spot. And I mean, like in those days, we then moved up to Fortescue Street into the McWilliam building. And we had the top floor up there overlooking the back. But I developed quite a work ethic from working with those guys.
Well, Ken Stevenson was
Ken,
there.
Absolutely. Ken's a good mate of mine too. Like Ken was a really good guy too. But the work ethic was good because you just really got stuck into it, and because you enjoyed it. You know, the day went really quickly, and always there early, always there late. You know, that's the way it happened. They're a good team of people, and young Bruce Thedeke was there at the same time, and Ken and Danny and I, we were part of the team, all part of what was happening. I mean, the thing about Ian would sit down at the end of every day. In the morning, he'd come in, he'd have a fully marked up red set of drawings, which was terrific. I mean, it teaches you a lot about quality control and dealing with detailing, and I learned a lot about detailing.
So did he stay there all night?
Probably just about all night. But Ian was very methodical and very good at the way that he did things. And as you know, he went ultimately to Conrad and Gallagher too in those days.
This is a question, and you probably have answered it in a way already. Who were the significant architects who have worked in your office?
Yeah, well, as I say, Brian Donovan, James Gross, Shane Thompson, and probably many others on the way through, but they're probably the ones that have, made their own mark in their own practices in their own way.
And do you feel your practice has had any impact?
Sorry.
Sorry.
Definitely John Hawkins, very significant. Out of all those people, I've got the greatest respect for John. He's just sensational. And he's just retired, and it's a pity because he's got so much work left in him. Do you know what I mean? He's just, I think, out of all those people that have worked with me, John and I have had the best working relationship.
No, I mean, you did work with Richard Allen.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
In the capacity of consultant, but
Richard and I are great mates, and he's, again, I've got a great respect for Richard, and like our families knew each other, and we got a good working relationship.
But just going back to the Mincom building, I mean, that was to be the site of the world's tallest building before Mincom was there, and yet in its position in the city, it was kind of next to a listed building, another one across the street.
Correct.
There are a whole lot of issues there about that site and how you related to those things, which were really not explored in Brisbane at that time.
No.
In terms of how one responds in an urban
Correct.
way to
Yeah.
old buildings.
Exactly. Well, I mean, the council were challenging me also on that development because the School of Arts was an important building, and that building going down Ann Street to keep the view corridor, there's this huge sort of 3-storey volumetric space that you can see right into the School of Arts, and also stepping the building back to the School of Arts is a really important issue. And right now they're going to stuff it up.
Yeah, they're going to fill it.
They absolutely mess it up, you know. There's a sense of, there's some things in the city that happen that shouldn't happen, you know, and that's one of them that's going to happen right now. But yes, there were those things. I mean, the scale of the building, actually, like it was really hard to make that building work financially because they wanted a lot of money. And of course, it's the old Canberra hotel site that was the dry hotel without any beer. And so the way actually that project worked is we could actually fit in around all the tunnels. We could actually fit in 360 cars underground that you couldn't see under the main podium, and that, because we could get the number of cars in, actually made the project work for a low-rise project. I mean, as you know, Manuzzo and Joe Biocchi-Peterson had this model of this 80-storey building or something on the site, and it was a very innovative idea because it actually came down and missed all the tunnels, and it actually straddled them. So to do that, obviously, you needed to get a bit of height out of the thing to make it work. Anyway, we had to come up with a different methodology on the site, and it does sit pretty well up there, I think, at the moment. And so it's going to be stuffed up with another building right up against the edge of it. So that's the way life is.
Well, the only other question here is, do you feel your practice has had any impact on present-day architecture in Queensland?
I would hope it would. I'm not sure exactly how. I currently sit on a number of panels and boards that I'm able to have some influence on. Like at the moment, we're developing the new Central City Master Plan. I chair the Independent Design Advisory Panel for the Brisbane City Council. I chair the Urban Design Advisory Panel for the Sunshine Coast Regional Council. I sit on the Board of Urban Places. I sit on Urban Futures Brisbane Board, which reports directly through the City Cabinet. So I do have some influence on mentoring and reviewing projects on all those locations around southeast Queensland. The Board of Urban Places, as you know, Rob's had quite a bit of influence on major infrastructure projects, and I think that that's one way that I've had an influence. I suppose the built work, I'm not sure exactly how much I've been able to influence the outcome of architecture. I've always had a sustainable bent. In the 70s, I was probably one of the first firms that wrote environmental policy, and I think that we have always, I mean, nature's and climate drives you, the way you design things, and I think from the early houses that I did, they've always been driven by climate and simple ways of putting things together. So I don't know, I suppose in some ways it's something for other people to judge just how much influence I've had. I think through people I've had influence, people that have worked with me, and just the way of practice. I mean, practice is a difficult thing to do. You go through lots of pressure points in practice because you've got deadlines and you've got legal issues to deal with, and you know, you've got great buildings to put up. So it's not easy to actually get through it all at the end of the day. So it's just hard to stand back and say, you know, what have you achieved? So,
yeah, it's probably for others to say that.
Exactly. Yeah.
But you did have an idea about the profession and having the image of an architect. I mean,
Correct.
You dressed like an architect. You were known as an architect. You were a man of style.
Exactly.
That you thought that was a necessary part of what you did?
Well, to some degree, I think that in 1979 I won the Institute of Architects Isolation Scholarship, and that was for marketing architectural services. So I ended up by going around the world and talking to all sorts of architects about how they marketed themselves are getting work and developing their business. And one of the people I interviewed was Norman Foster, Sir Norman Foster. And I had a discussion with him in his London office, ground floor office, with his neon sign on the front street. And Norman told me that he'd never really marketed, okay? So, but he told me that he designs everything from first principles. And he told me that he gets also around him the best consultants in the world, so that he can have a really strong team around him to get a really great outcome. And that's stuck with me from sort of like day one. And yes, I live the dream, and I think living the dream is important. You need to live the dream. I think that you've got to be very careful that you manage your ego when you're an architect. And I think as years have gone on, I've managed it a lot better than I have previously. And I think that, like I used to get a lot of publicity in those days, and I think that I don't need the publicity at the moment. I just like to be fairly quiet in the background and just do whatever work I can do. But publicity starts to chase you, and I think the money chases like the talent always. So I think that when you're I wouldn't ever call myself a superstar, but when you're in the limelight and you are winning awards and you've got lots of articles in the paper, and which I have had a lot of them, people sort of tend to you to become somebody who leads opinion. And I think that you need to be careful about what you say, and obviously say the right things about having your opinion is important, and it's important to get that opinion across where it's needed. And you and I know just recently we needed to get our opinion across on a certain matter about a heritage issue in the city, and you need to do that. You don't have to necessarily blurt it across all the newspapers. You have to know how to get it through political channels and be effective, I think. But I think, I suppose, yes, I wore bow ties and all the rest of it. And, I think that we grew up...
white suits.
And white suits. I mean, the issue was hats and sunglasses. It was to do what architecture was all about, and it was hats and sunglasses. And that's really that period where people were thinking about climate, and, it was the beginning of that thing. So,
well, Harry Seidler certainly
Yeah.
did those things too. I
Yeah.
mean, was he someone that you ever knew?
Well, not intimately till later in his life. I started to get to know him very well when he was designing Riparian. And actually, no, that's not quite true. I got to know Harry sometime before. I'm just trying to think when, because he put me in touch with Lynn Woodson, who was over in Elsinore, and I went to see Lynn her ceramic studio over there, and it was through Harry that made that introduction. So that must have been, 15, 20 years ago. But then, Harry actually said some very nice things about me. He actually got me into Docomomo, which is the thing in New York, it's about modernists, and he used to call me one of the last modernists. But I think that maybe I'm not, I don't know, but I didn't ever fit into a style. Harry sort of fitted into a style. Harry developed a very unique style, and I don't think there's any of my buildings that actually are stylistic where any, they're not really, any of them aren't the same, so to speak. They've always been something new.
It would be very difficult to have Harry Seidler's career in a city like Brisbane. We just didn't have the money and the power to get those clients.
You're absolutely right. And I think Brisbane, it's a very good point you've raised, Rob, because Brisbane, in terms of particularly in the residential scene, never had enough money to build decent houses. And it's only in the last 10 years that I've seen, and you've seen, some serious money come into people building houses that are got some substance to them.
And I guess houses that might actually go on and be preserved because they had some quality.
Exactly. So, I think that, yes, you're right. Seidler wouldn't have survived in Brisbane. Obviously, he's got a stamp in every city in Australia. And I suppose that's something that I mean, I haven't necessarily aspired to, but one of the things that I have done, I've always had a global reach. I mean, I've spent 20 years going to China. We've had an office in the Middle East for the last 5 years. I've got an office in Muscat. We just finished a big university over there at Sahar, and we designed a $200 million palace for the Sultan that he calls his guest house. He's not building it at the moment, but I think the global reach has always been important for people in the office. I've worked in 8 overseas countries. We did 5 expo projects in Seville, and we did those again with local architects and Fitch out of London, because we did the British Pavilion here in '88 with them. And I had a Spanish architect who worked in my office, so we went and set an office up there in Seville. We did the Australian Pavilion and Expo in Daejeon in Korea, and projects designed in Japan. We did a 100-storey building in Japan. It never got built, but Tim Fisher, who was a Deputy Prime Minister, was up there and signed the contract. You sort of, you know, you have to have a global reach. You really can't stay insular, because we live in a globe that is now even more expanding. You know, our electronics expose us to everything. I mean, you know, we could be buying a radio for the Mercedes off the, you know, whatever it is, you know, you just, everything you can do. So you've got to really think that global.
Well, you can do everything, but you haven't got enough time actually
Exactly.
to do it. So you have to be selective about
You do.
what's important.
Correct.
And
Yep.
make sure you do that.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, time is a very important element in one's life.
Well, thank you. I think we've
Thanks, Rob.
covered a lot of ground.
We covered a lot of ground.